Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a certified instructor for Forensics 578, Cyber Threat Intelligence at SANS, and Senior Director of Intel at Red Canary. Very excited to join you here. Late March, depending on where in the world you are, might be a little bit warmer, a little bit chilly, but happy to have you join us from around the world. I know we have folks joining from many locations. And our plan today is to dive into a specific annual threat report. So if you've joined the live stream previously last month, I covered a couple of different reports, annual, quarterly, from all these different teams who are sharing their research. And one came out a little over a week ago, and I was like, what better way to kind of dive in than hear from one of the authors of these reports themselves? So I'm really excited this month to be joined by Sean Gallagher. He is a principal threat researcher at Sophos XOps rather. Sean, welcome, and would love to have you just introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, Katie. So as you said, my name is Sean Gallagher. I have been at Sophos for the past 4 years. Previously, I was the national security editor and information security editor at Ars Technica for almost 10, capping off a fairly lengthy career in tech journalism. Former naval officer. I was an ADP security officer back in the day when that was a thing, when they called it ADP instead of IT. So I wasn't completely foreign to InfoSec when I started this job. And clearly when I was at Ars Technica, I was doing a lot of research into cybercrime and things like that. And so it was a pretty natural transition over to the role I've been in the past 4 years now.
Yeah, and I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that for anyone who maybe, I don't know, is in a non-technical career right now, which I reject the concept of non-technical because I think I first met you when you were a reporter. And of course you were technical. You were writing about cybersecurity. But for anyone who's thinking about, transitioning into a threat researcher role, what kind of compelled you to do that? How have you found that transition from journalism to threat research?
Well, my wife kind of pushed me into changing careers.
Nice.
But it was one of those things where I was sitting around diving into phishing kits and finding sites where the phishing operators had left their web panels open and poking around to see what they were doing and looking at what malware was up there. And this was off the clock from my day job. And my wife said to me, could you not be getting paid more to do that than what you do now for a living? As it turns out, I could. Journalism is journalism, but I'd been spending a lot. It helped that I had a general technology background, that I'd been an IT guy on and off. I had some roots in sort of how stuff works, but communication skills are very important in this space I'm in threat research, because you have to convey what's going on in an organized way to your customer. In my case, that's both the general public and other threat researchers and our internal teams. So we produce information in a way that's consumable both by our security systems and by the customers of our company and by peers and the general public. And so the better you can communicate about these things and to a broad audience and drill down in the places for specific audiences, identify what needs to be told to specific audiences and break it out for them, the better you can get the information across in a way that people can use. And we found that it's a big plus to have good communication skills in this role.
Absolutely. I found the same from my perspective, right? If you can't communicate verbally or in a written format in a way people are understanding, your research isn't going to have the same impact. So
I've also found that my very brief experience in doing graphic design is getting pulled back in more and more as it is right now. I'm working on circles and arrow diagrams for various incidents that we're doing reports on for that we've got some upcoming work on. That one of my colleagues on our team said, "Hey, Sean, can you do 20, 30 graphics to go into this 5,000 word report?"
Multivariate skill sets. Absolutely. Awesome. Well, speaking of writing, let's dive into the Sophos XOps team's threat report for 2024. Just came out a week or and a half ago or so. And so maybe to start, if you could just kind of explain the data behind the report, where did you all get the data and kind of how you approached writing this?
Sure. So we chose to focus on small business in this report because small and medium business make up a large portion of our customer base. Not necessarily out of proportion with the rest of the industry, but small business is a significant portion of our customer base, both through direct customers and through the managed service providers we work with. And so as a result, we have a lot of representative data from both our endpoint telemetry and our firewall telemetry that we have deployed on customer sites, plus incident data from our managed service team, from our managed security service team, the MDR team, and from our incident responders who go often into customers that have not been customers of ours before. And the data comes from other endpoints as well. We have hooks into a number of other vendors' endpoint protection software, so we're getting telemetry from that as well. And we're able to take from that detection data, incident data, AMC data, the things that are coming out of the anti-malware software interface from Windows and other sources, and aggregate it into a data lake we can work with to both look at what's trending, but also to tune protections and to develop. And I will work with our AI team, who's doing a lot of work around building defenses against various types of attacks that don't necessarily fall under what would normally be like signature-based detection type protection. So I went into that data. I talked with all of the teams that handle that data, and we pulled from that basically a year's worth of data of what happened in small and medium businesses that we work with, and what we saw as a trend in threats in that regard.
Nice. And yeah, I think that's one thing that struck me about this report, like being a little different than others, is that focus on SMBs, small and medium businesses, which I think is actually a very cool choice because, or as you say here, like more than 90% of the world's businesses are small and medium sized. The other thing that I was struck by, with that focus, it doesn't mean that large organizations aren't hit by the same things. As I was looking through the trends here, as we'll talk about, like I think the takeaway is applied to businesses of all sizes, but especially considering that small and medium businesses are also the organizations that often are under-resourced in terms of security. Like, exactly. I think that was a cool focus.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons why we wanted to take a deeper look at it, is because we know that small businesses especially, and small and medium businesses as well, tend to have less in the way of an organic ability to respond to threats. And so understanding what the type of threats they're facing is important. And also, they face, as you said, they face many of the same threats large organizations do. They just don't have the ability to respond to them themselves. So, one of the things we wanted to stress was the importance of, going beyond small businesses, going beyond just having the latest copy of some antivirus running on their system, because most of the attacks we talk about now are not, while there's malware involved in them, they are not necessarily just malware, and they are not necessarily malware that's running on the devices that are being attacked. So as some of the data we talk about later in the report goes into.
Awesome. Well, there's a summary up front, but let's just dive into kind of the sections. We talked about the data, and I'll say, I know that behind the scenes in these reports are like a bunch of data engineers, data scientists who organize the data to be able to find these, and that's no small feat. But talking about data as a target. So I'm curious, kind of, this section talks about data theft, credential theft, more than 90% of attacks involving that. So I'm curious, what are some of the kind of trends in terms of the data and credential theft area that you think are worth highlighting?
So one of the things that we're focusing on in protection these days, is cookie theft, which has become a bigger issue. It's become a major feature of a lot of the stealers that are out there, and as well as other credential theft, just from password stashes and things like that, keyboard logging and things like that, focusing on unprotected devices. A lot of that stuff gets filtered out to access brokers who sell access to various size companies, to people who are either going to abuse the infrastructure associated with those businesses or organizations, or are going to try and derive some value out of the contents of those networks, stealing additional information. So, your average low-level cyber criminal doesn't need to hack into your network on their own. They don't need to use some 0-day to get onto your network. They are typically obtaining access from somebody who specializes in that. And one of the things we found in some of the research I've done over the past few years is that there's a whole paid access and paid delivery business model out there in the cybercrime community, where if you pay money up front, somebody will give you access to somebody's network. They will even make the malware for you to deploy. And all you have to do is drop the malware that you get through whatever access you're given to exploit those networks further. And so it's really cheap to get into this business in the cybercrime world, because these accesses, as you can see, are sold for relatively low prices. Somebody's just trying to turn around some money real quick. $2,000 to get into a medium-sized, small-sized law firm, for example, as you get up on the screen. That investment can be multiplied in return several-fold once somebody has access to it through things like business email compromise and other exploitation of other resources, using files that are on the local network to extort people. Data extortion is emerging as something that happens not just with ransomware operators. In fact, ransomware operators are moving often away from encrypting data and just doing data extortion, saying, "I got your data, and you got to pay me," instead of having to go through all the work of encrypting stuff. Largely because antivirus and endpoint protection software now makes it much more difficult for them to run ransomware and encrypt your stuff. So if there's protection there, but they have access to your network, they will often just exfiltrate the data and extort you for it, or sell it on the market.
Yeah, I think a lot of people overlook this, right? Selling of data, like the access broker model, and realizing, thinking about lowering the barrier for cyber criminals. They don't have to have any kind of special expertise, right? If you have $2,000
Right.
and, have a basic script or a rat that you've bought, right? You can compromise an organization, right? Or gain that access.
Exactly.
So I think it's interesting kind of highlighting some of those dark web offerings to see just $190. Like, that is a good deal if I'm a criminal, right?
RDP access, they're selling RDP access there. So somebody's got a remote desktop access to the network, credentials included in that, right? And then once you have RDP access, you can execute code locally within that context that doesn't necessarily trigger any sorts of alerts if somebody's not monitoring the network.
Yep. And on that, data theft theme, kind of broke down the different malware categories. The majority of malware y'all observed in this stealer, spyware, keylogger category. And I think you were talking about this a little bit earlier. These stealers steal a bunch of information, right? It's, credentials, it's cookies, other things as well, right?
Yeah, and then they'll steal anything they can find that is of interest, including crypto wallet addresses, for example. One of the things we saw a lot with some of the rat tools that were being dropped over the past couple of years is something called Clipper malware that targets when you doing stuff with a crypto wallet and you're copying and pasting an address to send a transaction. It will steal the wallet address, but then it will insert another wallet address when you paste. Right. So that's one thing we've seen a bit of. But yeah, the stealer, they go after browser cookies, other cookies that may be stored by other software, and they will pick up information from your email. They'll harvest email addresses. They will key log your passwords and things like that.
Yeah, and I think one of the takeaways I always try to encourage people to think about is, I don't know, there's sort of this classic response mindset of, cool, I found the malware on the system, I'm just going to remove it or wipe the box and I'm done. But I think, noting all the things, the tokens, the cookies, the credentials, the cryptocurrency wallets, addresses, you might have to do a little more, like resetting credentials, looking at other actions from these stealers. That's something that I think a lot of people miss.
Right. And especially because a lot of the things that are going to be targeted by some of those stolen credentials are not going to be under your purview. They're going to be in cloud services, for example. So they get your Amazon key, your AWS key, or they get your credentials for Office 365, or for some other cloud service. They get a cookie to get into your Slack. All these are ways to get at you from outside of your platform by exploiting the cloud services you use. We've seen malware deployed through Slack by somebody stealing cookies and getting into intercompany chat and dropping files into chat that are malware. So the theft of credentials beyond what's on your own network is still pretty dangerous.
Yep, absolutely. And you all talk about some of the specific families, and I'll just give a +1 for the prevalence of these, right? Something I've talked about last month is, right, looking at different teams' visibility. Sophos team, Redline, Raccoon Stealer, right? Some of these others, like if you look at other top lists, like on any run, it's going to be these same stealers. Like Redline is everywhere. So
yes.
These are some common ones across many, many sources of visibility, I would say.
And we're seeing a lot of active. So on our signature side, we have seen a lot of active updates to Redline Stealer. So it's in active development. There are people making changes to it all the time. So it's important to really keep an eye out for that one. Raccoon Stealer is one of those malware as a service operations where you can go and pay money to have access to a web board and build the rat to order for your particular task, and then drop it either through a malware delivery as a service tool, where through people who use things like, and we go into this a little bit later, is some of the web delivery using ads on Google and things like that to sort of fool you into downloading stuff, or through malicious advertising. Use an ad blocker, people. So those Raccoon Stealer has been around a while, but it's been revised a few times. It's still a very effective rat, and it stays in active development. And as you can see here, we're seeing a lot of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to start to prioritize. Right, it's really overwhelming, all these malware families. And one of the things I use reports like this for is, okay, Redline, Raccoon. Right, pretty prevalent. If I have to decide where do I focus my team's resources in tracking stealer updates, like those are going to be two good choices because they're so widespread. Cool.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important to have as broad protection as you can. But yeah, as far as looking for low-hanging fruit, those are the ones that go after, because they're the ones that are most heavily traded on underground forums and in stores as far as malware goes. And most of your sort of low-level cyber criminals will go for those first because they're so well regarded and they are easily available.
Yep. And a lot of people aren't detecting them, and if they work, keep using them from a criminal perspective, right?
Exactly.
So next section, it's always interesting talking about ransomware, because I feel like so many people are like, I know, I'm so sick of hearing of ransomware, and I get it, but it's still a problem, right? As you all said, right? It's still a huge issue. So I'm curious kind of your takeaways from the ransomware ecosystem 2023 and so far in 2024.
Yeah, so there were some big shakeups in the ransomware world over the past couple of months, but late in the year last year. They didn't show up in our stats for 2023 because the top ransomware operations we saw active in the small and medium business segment, Lockbit, Akira, and Black Cat. Lockbit and Black Cat have been disrupted to some degree, and we have seen, beginning of this year, a substantial drop off in the number of incident responses we've had around ransomware so far since Lockbit got disrupted by law enforcement, and since Black Cat exit scammed their affiliates to try and keep from having to pay the money out for the ransom on a large target. So there's some change there, but this stuff still remains a threat, and it's still happening a lot. We've had a number of incidents so far this year already. Not as many as I said in proportion to last year, but still, Bionlan and a few other ransomware operators are still pretty active. We still see some of the ones that don't show up on this list, like Hunters and Mario and White Rabbit. Black Suit as well, which is low on the list here, has moved up a bit. So they're still active, and we're seeing them possibly picking up some of the affiliates that left Lockbit and Black Cat as a result of their problems. But the thing is that ransomware is a targeted attack usually. We don't see too many of cases where there's like some mass deployment through email spam of ransomware droppers or things like that. They tend to be fairly targeted, or they tend to be because a lot of them work as a service model. They tend to depend on affiliates getting access to deploy. So we've seen affiliates targeting weaknesses in software. So, for example, when MoveIt had a vulnerability, excuse me, there was a lot of pickup on that by ransomware affiliates to get access. And so whenever you see somebody announcing vulnerability, it doesn't have to be a 0 day for ransomware operator to take advantage of it. It can be a 1 year, and if it's not been patched, they're still out there looking for it. If you're not using Shodan to look for vulnerabilities on your own hardware on a regular basis, and you're not taking inventory of what you haven't updated, which is a lot for small business. I mean, I know small businesses are dependent upon software that they bought from somebody and deployed years ago, and they have no idea what they're running on it. They may have stuff that has vulnerabilities in it that they have no idea about. Tomcat stuff, for God's sake, going way back. If you're not updating stuff or finding new services on a regular basis, or making sure that you understand sort of the bill of lading of the software you're running, it's hard to stay up on those vulnerabilities. So ransomware operators are still using that to get in. The other place where we see ransomware getting in is with unmanaged devices that enter networks. And this is something that happens with small businesses all the time. Especially if you have contractors, or you have people who work from home full time who are using access to your network. If they do not have their devices running endpoint protection, if they're not inside, if you're not managing the security profiles of those devices, and they get onto your network, they can act as a roosting point for ransomware. And that's something, further down, we talk about ransomware, remote ransomware attacks, and so we've seen those growing. So over the past year, we've seen the number. This is a chart of the number of remote ransomware incidents we've seen. And I had somebody ask me, are those numbers a lot? I mean, because 120 ransomware attacks in a quarter, is that a lot? And I said, well, it is. It is if you're the one who got hit, right? So, I mean, think of these as all targeted attacks. That's a lot of attacks in a quarter.
And think about the fact that your team doesn't see everything. No one sees everything. So imagine, right? Everyone has different security providers, and no one knows how bad it is, but this is kind of a glimpse into how bad it is, which seems pretty bad.
Exactly. So when we talk about remote ransomware incidents, we're talking about ransomware being executed on a machine that was not protected and accessing the storage of other machines on the network without executing on those devices. So they're directly mapping to the drives of those computers, of those devices. So it's not like I'm running it on the internet and somehow encrypting your computers remotely, or I'm running a PowerShell command to load the ransomware into memory on a device to run it just there. This is executing ransomware on a device, on a toehold on the network. They've established a beachhead on an unprotected device, often a server, because people like to say I don't want to run antivirus on my server because it slows the performance down.
You might break something. So it's like something exposed to the internet. And we see the same thing.
And it happens to be connected to the internet, and it happens to have, have ways of people getting access to it to launch from it. So people think servers, that they don't run anything. I don't have to worry. Well, they do. And this is where we see a lot of these remote ransomware attacks coming from, is the ransomware being run from a server, which has in its store administrator credentials, right? Which then allow them to
keys to the kingdom,
network,
right?
Exactly, traverse the network and get and enumerate all the devices on the network, and then map directly to the C drives of every Windows computer on the network.
Yeah. And I think the remote aspect, that's something that I don't know that I see everyone break out, but I think that's an important distinction. My team sees the same. And it's really heartbreaking because even like small and medium businesses, they're trying to do good security monitoring. And then there's just like one or two servers that they've opted out, or maybe a firewall that's older and outdated. And so often that's how adversaries gain that foothold. And then you have great monitoring elsewhere, but sometimes you have to kind of play catch up. So
and we often see organizations where, even in the SMB space, where we only protect a portion of the organization, like a department or a remote office picks us up for protection, and the attacks come from other places in the enterprise. So, this is a big problem.
Yep. And, I think one thing you mentioned, it was interesting, the shift so far in 2024. Okay, Lockbit, right, got taken down. Maybe Black Cat is fading away. But the thing that frustrates me about this ecosystem is it feels like every week there's a new one. Like you mentioned Mario. I never heard of Mario. But, I think you noted.
We pick these up as malware generic, right? Because there's no way to have a signature for all of them. The other thing we see a lot is, while these attacks are usually targeted, they are also opportunistic often, right? So somebody has access and they decide to do something. And so that some of the things that don't show up here is we find sort of these one-off attacks where somebody writes like a ransomware in Python and deploys it, or they're using network mappings to a Samba server or a network attached storage device to encrypt the contents of a Linux machine, or encrypt the contents of that network storage device, running a script on one unprotected machine that has access to the storage area, right? So, and they'll leave some random ransom note. So we see a lot of those. We're seeing a growth in that space, and we have some upcoming research in that space about what one of our researchers, Matt Wixie, referred to as junk gun ransomware, right? So it's like, really, it's like the Saturday Night Special of ransomware.
Nice. I like that.
So, and they're everywhere, right? So, I mean, you can buy them off of a forum, or you can write your own. We've seen attackers use scripts that use 7-zip as ransomware, right? So they will like drop in a utility and encrypt your create encrypted archives of your files, and then delete the files with a PowerShell script or with a Python script or whatever. And those don't fall under the purview of one of those ransomware signatures, right? We pick them up as encryption events, and we have something called CryptoGuard that blocks that sort of thing. But we detect those things, but we can't necessarily detect the ransomware behind it, because there's no known signature for something that is, unless you are looking into AMSI and saying, oh, it's running this weird way. And as I said, 7-zip and things like that, a lot of people are bringing a lot of other tools along with them to do the job, that are often considered to be benign tools. So you have to be really aware of what's going in. That's, like if you don't use 7-zip as an organizational standard, and then suddenly it shows up on your network somewhere, you may have a problem.
You might want to look into that. Yeah, I think, one of the challenges is all these names, and, sometimes you just see something like 7-zip, you're not going to be able to say that's a specific ransomware group with a name. And, the
Right.
other thing that I think is important is, okay, Lockbit may be disappearing-ish, but I think you noted like other groups are stepping in, right? Maybe picking up the same affiliates. We talked about kind of the access broker model, and we know that's part of ransomware intrusions. And so it's kind of frustrating, right? Like there's a takedown and then someone else steps in. So we'll see.
Right.
I don't know. I'm hoping 2024 will be better, but
the other thing about Lockbit is that Lockbit had a code leak a while back. So Lockbit 2.0 is the source code of it is available to people who want to build their own ransomware. And so when we have detections for Lockbit 2.0 that we're still seeing Lockbit based ransomware. It is just not Lockbit, the actor, right? Yeah. Same thing with Conti. Conti is dead, but Conti based ransomware is still out there. People are still using pieces of that code as part of their ransomware attacks.
Another challenge with, are we talking about people or are we talking about code when we say something like Lockbit? Right. And I mean, that's on all of us. We all use those things interchangeably.
So when we talk about incidents where we're following up on an incident, we always, when we're talking about the actor, we know who the actor is because they dropped a ransomware note, and so we've identified the actor. When we talk about detections, when we talk about these, so under incidents, we know it's Lockbit there, right? So that's, we know what was attempted to drop. We were able to find the ransomware note that was attempted to drop. We know what was going on there. With ransomware detections, when we talk about the number of unique customer detections we had, then we're talking about signature, right? And so that's why you'll see the big listing for generic there, because those are things that we couldn't identify. But we were able to identify Lockbit by signature. We were able to identify Black Hat by signature, and the rest of those. We had updated detections for those. But like I said, can we attribute those directly to those gangs? No, because this is the cases where we block the ransomware from ever being deployed because we detected it, and we can't say for sure that was blocked, that was attached to that actor, that the ransomware as a service that was is usually delivered by, or was being used by somebody else, or just pieces of it being used by somebody else. Yeah. So that's the problem we run into.
Nice. I think that's a helpful distinction, and why there's generic in there. Well, we could talk about ransomware all day. I'll just drop a link in if you are interested in more on ransomware. SANS Ransomware Summit, totally free and online, coming up in late May. So we'll see what happens in 2024. I'm going to make a crazy prediction that, hey, maybe ransomware is not going to go away, but we'll see. Hoping it's better than 2020.
I think we can say without a doubt that ransomware will not disappear in 2024. The one trend we have been seeing moving forward is that ransomware operators, like I said earlier, are moving more towards extortion without encryption, and less towards actually encrypting and holding ransom your data. They're just holding your data for ransom without encrypting it. They tend to get better payouts that way, because people are afraid of having their data breached. We've also seen that, if they have your data, they're probably going to sell it anyway. So even if you pay them, so that's
always a challenge.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, Moving on to the next section, kind of the cybercrime as a service, malware as a service, which kind of talked about a little bit with some of the stealers that fall in this. And
Right.
I'd say one of the big highlights in 2023 was Quackbot, right? Disruption in 2023. So I'm curious your take on that. Do you think that disruption worked? I saw February 2024, I think, from your team said, hey, Quackbot is back. So I'm curious your thoughts on Quackbot.
So we saw a little bit of Quackbot later in the year. It's not clear. It's not quite the same Quackbot we're used to, right? So, but they're trying to find ways to make it operate. So it's not gone. It's not gone. There are pieces of that code that are being used by other people, and also Quackbot. I'm sure the team behind Quackbot, who is still at large, because they live in places where law enforcement can't touch them. They are actively developing new infrastructure, and so I don't think they're gone. They were, even though they were taken out about halfway through the year, they were still the most active after Lockbit. They were the most observed malware that we saw, right? So, and they were in terms of actual incidents we saw, right? And then as far as the actual the overall for the year in terms of malware delivery frameworks we saw, they were still in the top 2, even though they were gone for half the year. Agent Tesla has been around for forever, and it is still under development, and it is still ubiquitous, right? So we still see that fairly frequently. Emotet, another one. There was some takedown there. Why are we still seeing that? Why is it still in the top 3? Well, because they still have momentum, and there are still people. There's still people trying to use it in ways to try and work around the problems Emotet had. So, but these others are on the rise, and we've seen a lot more of Picabot, for example, another one that's sort of like a Quackbot wannabe successor, right? And there's some others that are positioning themselves as successors to Quackbot.
Yeah, I'm going to guess the 2024 map will look pretty different, but yeah, it's fascinating to me. Things like Emotet that people are saying are gone, still around, or maybe sometimes persistence lingering. So
yes, yeah. Well, I mean, and these are things that, again, these are unique customer report. These are unique detections. So these numbers are based on the number of detections we saw that were for specific customers, not computers, right? There are many computers in these customer networks, right? So we just went by unique customer reports. So these are businesses. So we are seeing, and so if I went by the number of computers that were involved, we'd be in a whole different business here. We'd be much bigger numbers. But we see these tools that are supposed to be defunct, repurposed frequently, right? Because the thing about Quackbot and Emotet is they're modular, right? And so it's easy to bolt some new functionality onto them and use the same malware to deliver something else without having to worry about the bot piece of it, right? So it may not have the same command and control system involved, but that's not a problem. I just add some new code to it, and it turns into something else entirely, and has other functionality, and it can communicate with a different C2, the command and control system. So while these are not, we're not seeing a huge amount of Emotet right now, it's still out there as sort of like background radiation, as I like to refer to it. I mean, it's there.
It's a good metaphor. Moving on, talking about how does this stuff get in? We already hit on a few of these. We talked a little bit about vulnerabilities. One thing that I keyed in on, because my team has seen the same thing, right? The use of search engine optimization. Huge last year, and I think so far in this year. For those who aren't familiar, could you explain kind of what SEO poisoning is?
Sure. So there's 2 ways to get something into the results of a search engine search. One of them is to use malicious Google advertising or malicious search engine advertising, where you buy AdWords that correspond to something that you want to target and get your malicious ad put up in the top of the results. The other way is through search engine optimization, which is to basically do your best to organically raise your malicious site in the search engine ranks for specific search terms. So we've seen this a bunch in other spaces. So, for example, I did some research about a year and a half ago into how was raccoon stealer getting into so many places. And one of the things we discovered was there was a malware delivery as a service business that used advertising, used SEO on these blogs that had been set up as basically farms for malicious links to promote them in the search engine results for specific searches on free or cracked software, right? Mm-hmm. So, you got somebody who's like looking for a free copy of a piece of enterprise software they want to use because they don't have the budget for it. They will search for it on Google or Bing or whatever their choice is. And because these sites have been SEO'd so much through links from other places, from use of keywords, through and links with keywords from other blogs, and placement on other sites. There are these vast networks of WordPress blogs that are being run by people who are in this business, specifically in the business of getting malware links in the right place. And then they have these whole advertising networks behind them that are malicious advertising networks that basically redirect links 5 or 6 times to make it not obvious where the links go to, and then deliver the malware. And so there has been a couple of malware operators recently who have specifically targeted terms that were relevant to IT people. And so if somebody's looking for some way to do something specifically, the result fairly high up in the results, often the top of the results, either through advertising or through SEO, they would click on that to get a tool that was supposed to help them do what they were going to do. They would get a legitimate installer, but the installer had been weaponized to also install malware. So they'd get what they were looking for, but they would also get an extra surprise.
Yeah, and I really like the image at the top of this blog on the droppers, like free software, right? You're just searching for something, a legit software, and you get something a little extra. I think the team, I know my team in Red Canary actually saw your blog on nitrogen, which was interesting because we actually saw the same thing and we didn't know what it was called until we read your blog. And so this is really prevalent. And I think you mentioned earlier, like for the malvertising side, use an ad blocker. What do you think, like for the SEO poisoning side, are there any ways people can try to prevent this?
That is much more difficult, and that is going to require some help from the folks in the search engine side. Because, one of the things that we have to worry about there is, first of all, with the advertising, will have to change the model of how they accept keyword advertising and verify destinations, which is very difficult to do when the back end has ways of changing where things go, right? I think this is one of those places where a whole school of education has to happen. People have to learn to look out for things that are suspicious. And only, like, if I'm looking for a tool and it points to a domain that looks kind of like, it looks a little junky, looks a little bit on the shady side, don't go there, right? I mean, and that takes a certain amount of internet wisdom to understand when a domain name that is associated with a link is not right? So
some of these look very compelling, right?
Oh, yes.
It looks exactly, they'll, copy the page. The graphics are very similar. So,
and unfortunately, a lot of the links vendors use don't really help the game either, because they use these funky domain shortening tools or link shortening tools sometimes in advertisements, or they'll use custom domains for advertising campaigns that look pretty iffy themselves, but they're legitimate. and then you have ones that look very legitimate and are in fact links to malicious sites. So yeah.
Yep.
I would say never click on anything with a .xyz top level domain. That's just my bottom line. It's just don't do it.
I'll say that I see this so commonly as well. I'm afraid to search anything from a search engine anymore, right? Like anytime I search for something, I'm like, let me just like go to the actual link that I have bookmarked. But it is a tough one to prevent. So
it is, especially since, a lot. I mean, I don't know how much of my day is spent in a search engine. Like,
exactly.
Where have I seen this before? Oh, let me see. And so it's, and in our business, we depend on SEO to like get our intelligence out so people can see it. Like, I'm going through and making sure I've got like lines of code that are like lines of code in our blog, so that if somebody Googles that line of code, that line of PowerShell, they'll get our blog post, so they'll understand that it's bad, right? So it's a game we play to try and save people, but then it's the same game the bad guys are playing. So,
yep. It's an interesting one. And again, one I think has continued in 2024 for sure. Next category, dual use tools. I'm curious, how do you define kind of dual use tools? Why do these matter?
Okay, so dual use tools are tools that are often used for legitimate purposes by network administrators or, anybody else in the organization for, support purposes, utilities, right? Remote access tools. And they're also used by cyber criminals because they can get free trials, or they may have license numbers that have been compromised, and they can be deployed because they have legitimate digital signatures on the software and they won't trigger as malware. And they give them the same capabilities or even more capabilities than some malware has. So, advanced IP scanner, PC Hunter, stuff like that. You can find out all sorts of things about the network that they're on. AnyDesk, Screen Connect, some of those other things. They give you remote desktop access. You do not have to have the RDP credentials to get onto a network. There doesn't have to even be RDP on the network. And AnyDesk and things like that have long been favorites of a lot of tech support scammers and folks like that, because they give them full control of the remote system they've gotten onto to do things, right? So we have actually seen AnyDesk become the most popular dual-use tool. In fact, as you can see from this chart, AnyDesk and PSExec, another remote execution tool, are past Cobalt Strike. Now, Cobalt Strike used to be the main thing that all the bad guys used, as well as all the red teams used, right? So now Cobalt Strike, because it's become so recognizable through detections and people are already sus of it, right? It's falling down the list. AnyDesk is now like the top one. We see it in so many different kinds of attacks. Very popular with ransomware operators because they can get in and do things on unprotected systems, and it looks like normal software. And the activity may look like normal, especially if somebody's using, say, for example, a managed service provider to do their network administration. It may look like normal behavior, right? So
that's what's so tough about these dual use tools is unless you know what should be allowed in your network. And even if like sometimes users just download stuff, right? Because they're trying to use, knowing if that's legit, if it's just unauthorized versus an adversary. Like I know those calls are really tough to make for organizations.
Yeah. And then a bunch of stuff on here, these, like 7-zip, like I mentioned earlier with ransomware attacks, right?
Yeah.
These are things people use to manage their own desktops, right? I've got to archive this stuff. I got to free up some disk space. I want to send a bunch of files to somebody. I'm going to do that. So these are things we see used a lot already. And especially if you're in an environment where there's no central IT organization dictating which tools you use in a small business environment, that showing up is going to be not a red flag for a lot of people. And then there are a bunch of things on here that are open source tools that are out there that are used by red teams and penetration testing teams all the time. Mimikatz, Simpacket, Lazan, that are freely available to anybody, right? You just have to you can find them in a GitHub page, and they can be modified and used however somebody wants to use them. Usually they're used just off the shelf the way they're written, with very minor things. We often see telemetry pointing back to places that shouldn't be going to, like back to the original developer, right? But they're still doing this stuff, right? So these are all things that we cannot block legally, right? So I can't like flag it as malware because it's legal software, right? But we tend to detect it as potentially unwanted applications.
Yep, and that's tough from a decision point of, is this unwanted? Is it an adversary? Is it an admin? So, but as you said, these tools give an adversary so much, right? So many capabilities that, again, something I think we'll keep seeing a lot of. Cool. Well, moving along, we talked a little bit about vulnerabilities. We talked about MOVEit. Got to get to the supply chain attack section. This is something that I know, creates a little bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but we can kind of get through that and talking about what you actually saw. I'm curious, the nature of these supply chain attacks. What did you see in 2023? What do you think are the key takeaways here?
Well, the big one we saw that we had to wait a while to talk about because it required clearing a bunch of things with the folks in Redmond was the use of the of Microsoft signed drivers, right? So there were groups of people who were managing to misuse the hardware vendor program for getting drivers signed by Microsoft to write malicious drivers and get them signed with Microsoft signed certificates. And as you may know, anything that's signed by Microsoft is generally is on the white list, so to speak, is on the okay list. I hate the term white list because it has other implications, right? But it's on the pre-approved list. Do not check this list, right? So most malware protection will not detect anything that has a valid Microsoft signature on it. That means that these people were able to deploy essentially managed detection and response software killers using these drivers, because drivers give kernel level access and allow an attacker to try to push out of memory any malware protection that's running on a machine. And so we were able to detect some of this going on. We keyed in on the fact that it was coming from drivers that were signed by Microsoft, sent a list of these drivers we were detecting, these certificates we were detecting associated with these to Microsoft, along with some of the other malware protection vendors in the space were doing the same thing. Microsoft resolved those things, basically, banning those certificates from being able to be used in executables. But that's an ongoing problem because we see it with other vendors' signed certificates. Mm-hmm. There are also this thing called bring your own vulnerable driver, right? So somebody will take a driver shown to be vulnerable on a previous version of a software package that may have been patched, but the driver is still has a signature on it and it's still valid. And they will deploy it themselves into a network. It doesn't get detected by malware malware detection because it's a signed piece of software, unless you're specifically looking for it. And then they will use that software to sideload malware, and it'll execute from a trusted process and allow them to do bad things to your operating system, to your malware protection.
Yeah, a lot of these are, again, tough because you have to sort of challenge what you trust and what's allowed. And right, just because something is signed by a company, I would say challenging your assumptions. If it's doing bad things, right, some of the times that you observed behavioral rules. Okay, if you see something, don't just assume, oh, it's known good, but actually digging in. That's how I've seen a lot of these kind of supply chain issues get surfaced.
Exactly. So majority of the time we're catching these things because of behavioral detections, where we see something doing something that it shouldn't be doing. And we have things on our software called tamper protection, which detects when something in the software is attempting to do something to shut off protection. It isn't always effective if somebody's got like 0 ring level access to the operating system. But it does detect a lot of these side load attacks and things like that. It is very effective in protecting against those things, but also because we're collecting a lot of the telemetry data from behavioral, even in places where we find where stuff is getting disabled, we are often able to quickly respond to it and do something about it. But again, this requires us to go through disclosure with the software vendors. And let me be clear, this happens to everybody's software. It doesn't matter. It's not like
not
it's
picking
not
on
like
Microsoft. They're just used everywhere, right?
Microsoft, it happens to every security vendor too, right? Yeah. Every security vendor has a version somewhere back in history that has a driver or some sort of DLL that is vulnerable, some sort of executable that can be tricked into loading another driver through side loading or something like that. And they've been patched, but the internet is forever. And so that stuff is still around there. I did some research last year around a driver from another prominent malware vendor. We didn't say anything about which malware vendor it was for a while because we had to go through ethical disclosure on it. The thing is that yes, that was from an enterprise version of a malware protection tool that was probably about 8 years old. And it had long been fixed, but the signature was still valid and it was still being used to attack our customers and other people's networks.
A long tail to get cleaned up.
Yes.
Well, we are quickly coming towards the top of the hour. So there's sections on social engineering, kind of as we're wrapping. Any kind of key takeaways you'd have for people here as they should kind of read further in these last sections?
Yeah. So the thing about social engineering and like the spam side, thanks to Microsoft's Mark of the Web stuff on Office, we are seeing a lot less malicious attachments in email. Instead, what we're getting is attempts to get you to download stuff from the web from email, right? Either using an image with a QR code in it, or we've seen that, or using a PDF with a blurred out thing you need to click it to download a full version of, and instead of it being a full version of PDF, it's malware. So they're using weaponizing inherently benign PDFs and images by using them to carry information that gets the target to download something malicious. And we've also seen scammers using the spam malicious email that get people to call them, and then by voice instructing them to do things. So that's one side of it. On the mobile side, and this is critical. Pandemic moved a lot of what's going on in small business to mobile devices, right? I don't know how many. You've got people using Square and Toast and all that, and all these sorts of small businesses as their point of sale system now, that they didn't do before because they moved to online ordering and things like that, and they got rid of the cash register. They got rid of whatever their old point of sale system was, went to a tablet or to a phone even. Mobile devices are now a number one target for malware operators. We have seen
something that not a lot of people are looking at, right? So
yeah, and social engineering there is a big deal. So as an aside, one of my sons is a co-owner in a coffee shop co-op. Somebody broke into their place and stole their Toast tablet.
Interesting.
So the question. So then you start thinking, okay, how can they be monetized? It's a whole other threat model
Yeah. How do you respond to that?
But passwords and things like that on devices, if you can get another app into, if somebody's using the same device for all these things, if they're running an app on their phone, Android especially, but also iOS is not necessarily immune as well. We're seeing malicious apps getting onto devices that are targeting the data on those devices. And then there's also a lot of social engineering going on there. So, and I talk in this report about something that I've been tracking for a while, the pig butchering stuff, which is an entirely other can of worms. But social engineering attacks and scams have a huge impact on small business because they share so much between individual and business. We saw last year a bank in Kansas got taken over by the FDIC because a bank president fell for one of these crypto scams and was actually taking money out of the bank's deposits to try and get his money back. So there can be,
can't overlook those either, right? Social engineering.
So and between that and business email compromise, have had lots of reports of people getting emails or having business email compromise where they were social engineered into giving up passwords, or somebody spoofed their account information with a lookalike domain and got information about their customers and was sending new invoices to customers or telling them to do wire transfers to different banks. It may not affect their systems internally, may not affect their own network or their services, but it's affecting their customers, so it affects that. Yep.
Well, lots more threats to dive into here. So we'll just paste the overall threat report one more time. And a lot of actions here, MFA, education, but we are at time actually. So Sean Gallagher, thank you so much for joining us this month. Again, Sean's from Sophos XOP. Definitely check out this report just to highlight a lot of the same things that Sean's team saw, my team at Red Canary saw in our annual threat detection report. Always good to kind of look at different sources. That's the whole idea behind these annual reports. And as we are wrapping here, a couple of upcoming things. Anyone who's newer to this industry, right? Maybe you are making a career change like Sean did years ago from journalism. We have the New to Cyber Summit coming up in April very soon. So that'll be awesome, free, live online. So check that out in addition to the Ransomware Summit. And with that, that's all we have for you this month. Administrative note, STAR is going to be taking a bit of a break for the next couple months. So in our absence, invite you to join the other live streams like Wait Just an InfoSec. And then we will see you hopefully on a future SANS live stream. So thank you again, Sean, for joining. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Take care, everyone.